Chapter 12. The sound of the cello rose from the right of the pulpit to the high arched space above. A long, deep note was held and released and seemed to lose itself slowly in the complex Gothic tracery of coloured glass that occupied the east end of the church. There, in the bright stained glass, a nameless saint blessed a lamb, and above him a woman with a long, luminous face dried Christ's feet with her hair. The sound changed. A series of deeper notes followed in quick succession. They seemed to sustain themselves in the air between him and the cello player, whose face was almost completely covered by her dark hair. She wore a black dress with no adornment, and an incongruous pair of heavy black boots that made no compromise to the occasion. As those notes died away, to be followed by a few bars that almost seemed to belong to a different piece, her hair moved to reveal her face, and Martin James confirmed that the cello player was indeed Samantha Merriam. He had suspected it from the start. He'd come into the church after the service had begun because he'd only learned that morning from David Young that everyone else at Plas Wern Las had already left for Parker Merriam's funeral. The body must have been released from police custody quite suddenly. He had no idea why no one had bothered to tell him the day before. Perhaps they thought it was no business of his, or had just forgotten to mention it. Since his odd encounter with David Young a few nights previously, he had been quite reclusive. Only the day before, he had taken some sandwiches and a flask and had walked onto the hills above the house all afternoon, savouring the meeting between rough field and sky and trying to shake off his uncertainties about his murdered aunt and his strained relationship with his Uncle Paul. The others had mostly left him alone in the Apple House, apart from Queenie, who brought him his meals and the occasional cup of coffee. His relative isolation had seemed to work, until this morning, until he'd seen David Young, who told him what was happening. He changed his clothes immediately and had driven the 15 miles or so to the little church on the edge of town, where he discovered that the funeral service for Parker Merriam had already started. The music stopped, and Samantha Merriam placed her cello on its music stand on the altar steps before returning to her place in the third row next to Marion Keynes and Queenie, who sat in an odd, hunched position. In the row in front of them, Martin recognized the tall, dark-suited shape of Michael Portman, who was accompanied by several other people from Treddeg Rectory. At the end of the row, in a space that seemed to have been specially prepared for the occasion, his Uncle Paul sat in a wheelchair with a blanket over his knees. When the vicar, a pale-faced man with thinning ginger hair, began to speak, Martin James tried hard to follow, but soon found himself drifting. Too much had happened for him to concentrate on the comments of someone who didn't seem to have known Parker Merriam that well. And with his hives, he added another facet to his personality, the vicar was saying, but Martin's concentration was elsewhere, on what had happened the night before. He had been reading the newspaper cuttings again, going over the details of his Aunt Henrietta's murder. He'd been trying to puzzle out why anyone would want to kill a seemingly harmless 91-year-old woman whose only fault seemed to have been that she was more than a little self-obsessed. That might have been annoying, but it hardly seemed to be enough motive for murder. He He could have sworn that he had been reading with the small bedside light on, but he must have fallen asleep. When he woke up, it was dark, and there was a strange series of snuffling sounds coming from the bed beside him. When he reached out, he felt the warm, rounded contours of someone else. "I don't want no light. I want it switched off." It was a London voice that Martin recognised straight away. "Queenie?" There was no immediate reply. The snuffling sounds increased, and then she began to sob quietly. "I don't want no one to hear," she said. "I don't want no one to know." "Know what?" "Hold me." He put his arm around her and drew the duvet around them both. She was shivering. "He was walking across the room towards the fireplace. He was wearing a suit, but he didn't seem to have nothing on underneath. No pullover, no shirt, no nothing." "So?" "You might not think it sounds scary, but it was. Everything went cold, and all of a sudden there was a cold light coming from that book he was reading." "What book?" "Don't know. Small book. Poems, something." "Are you sure?" "I said, didn't I?" Martin didn't know what to make of it. He pulled her closer to him to stop her shaking. He thought about what Marion had said soon after they'd met, that Queenie had a special talent and that she had twice been tested for extrasensory perception. He thought about this and about how his aunts had lived quietly enough in Plas Wern Las with their love of history and historic preservation until the murder. He thought about his Uncle Paul and why he had never been closer to him. He thought about almost everything except the body of the woman who was lying next to him. After a while, he stopped thinking and lay there, just feeling her breathing. And then the inevitable happened. The vicar stopped speaking suddenly. He must have completed his sermon, Martin realized. The middle-aged woman sitting next to him, who wore a headscarf and a close-fitting brown coat, nudged her husband, who, like Martin, must have been in danger of drifting off. Then the organ started up again, and the congregation began to sing hymn number 116, which showed on the board attached to the nearby pillar. It was one of those nondescript modern hymns that Martin didn't know or connect to, and he was glad when it was over. Then, when the service was obviously finished, 4 fit-looking older men came out of the second row and lifted the coffin onto their shoulders. After a moment's hesitation, Marion Keynes, Samantha Merriam, and Queenie filed out of their row to be followed by a tall 30-something man in a black suit, whom Martin had not seen before. He obviously had some connection to Parker Merriam's family, because after him, the other mourners began to move. Martin joined them, somehow resenting the fact that it was the ex-cabinet minister who was responsible for pushing his uncle's wheelchair. Outside, the sun was bright. A bird twittered somewhere, and there was the sound of the occasional car. Nearer, a gravel path led to a freshly dug grave at the far end of the churchyard. Martin followed the path, and it led him to the others, who were grouped around the grave. Martin didn't watch as the vicar pronounced his blessing and the bearers lowered the coffin into the open grave. Instead, he was looking at Samantha Merriam, who was crying quietly at the edge of the group around the grave. Marion Keynes had one arm around her, and the 30-something man in the black suit stood nearby. Then, after the vicar had finished, and Samantha and some of the others had filed forward to drop earth on the grave, there was a commotion at the front. "It's your fault," the man in the black suit said to Martin's Uncle Paul, so that everyone could hear. "If you hadn't lent him your car, this might never have happened." "Simon!" Samantha Merriam stepped forward and tried to put her hand on his shoulder. And you're not much better. Where were you when he needed you? What have you been doing all this year? Martin raised an arm to try and protect Samantha and his uncle. Look, he said, I'm sure everyone realizes you're upset. Upset? Why should I be upset just because my father's been murdered? It was then, as he was still trying to calm Simon Merriam down, that Martin spotted a familiar figure on the edge of the knot of the people around the graveside. Gwendryth James. Martin made no move towards the detective, whom he wasn't sure had seen him. Then Gwendryth James moved out of his eye line as Samantha Merriam put her arm round her brother, who seemed to be on the verge of breaking down again. That seemed to work for a while, despite their apparent disagreements. Then a shadow passed overhead, and the crowd began to disperse as two workmen waited discreetly in the distance. Drops of rain began to fall as Martin left Samantha Merriam and pushed forward to follow his uncle. There was a large, sleek black car at the entrance to the cemetery, a Mercedes that probably belonged to Michael Portman. I need to talk to you, Martin, Uncle Paul said quietly, as the wheelchair drew level with the black car. It was a command, not a request. After agreeing to go to the rectory as soon as he could, Martin walked towards his Land Rover as Michael Portman helped his uncle into the other car. I think I owe you an apology. It was a while later. Martin had made his way to the old rectory and must have been a few minutes behind the Mercedes, as by the time he arrived, his uncle was already ensconced in his wheelchair in the annex in the front of the house. Clouds moved across the bright blue bay. A gull screeched somewhere. What for? 20 years. Of what? Neglect. I don't think you can say that, Martin said. You looked after me as best you could. When you sent me away to school, you thought you were doing the best thing. And I wasn't. Martin thought for a moment about the difference between boys like him, the boarder, and the day boys like Gwendryth James. Theoretically, in St. Illtyd's, there had been no difference in treatment. But practically, the day boys, though often less well off, had been able to escape at the end of the school day, and their weekends, apart from sports matches, had always been mysteriously of their own. Perhaps not, he managed. And you want me to acknowledge that? Despite the fact that his uncle was over 90, he was still sharp, and Martin was forced to concede that that was the direction he'd been heading in. It's too late now, anyway. Didn't sound very satisfactory, even to him. I hope not. That's not what I meant, anyway. I meant with your father. Until not long after you were born. I meant that 20 years. From the time he inherited Plas Wern Las until his death. Who have you been talking to? Merlin Griffiths. You sent me to see him, remember? Uncle Paul was silent for a moment. He fiddled with the rug over his knees. The skin over his knuckles looked almost transparent. Do you know, I turned down the offer from Western Winds, don't you? Martin nodded. That wasn't what he wanted to talk about. Is anything else the matter? He asked after a while. Parker Merriam would never have gone over the edge of that gully on his own. Something happened to him. Even if that's true, you didn't call me back to talk about that, did you? What then? What was that about my father? He left me. with a responsibility. I know that. Which was all the more acute because I neglected him for nearly 20 years. Can you explain? That's what I'm trying to do. You see, I was born just after the Great War. I know all that. No, I don't think you do. Your father wasn't born till years later. I know that too. Martin, I don't think I need permission to speak. But you do need to give yourself permission to listen. Martin James had to acknowledge that his uncle was right, that he had felt an inner resistance to what Paul was about to tell him. There was something almost embarrassing about suddenly being shown a glimpse of the inner workings of a man who up to now had kept himself very close indeed. No one expected your aunt's murder. It was a shock. I was almost 40, but your father was still in his 20s. But we knew she'd go sometime, of course, but not like that. It was brutal. Were you there when it happened? No, in London, in the old house in England's Lane. So was your father. Martin knew about the house in Hampstead that had belonged to his grandfather, though he had never seen inside it. The place was almost legendary in the family. His grandfather had been a very successful solicitor. As a young man, he had qualified in Wales and then moved to London, where he'd eventually become a partner in a firm that specialized in dealings with the Crown estates. His grandfather had died years before Martin was born. If you weren't even in Wales at the time, I don't even see how you could have had much to do with it. They were brought up with servants and a sense of entitlement. Never left them. But why would anyone want to kill Henrietta? I don't know. There was blood on the floor, they say, and on the walls. Whoever did it had a grievance. You weren't close to her? I liked her well enough, I suppose. But your father understood her better. That's why she left the house to him. I respected her even if I sometimes questioned her judgment. That poet, for instance, I think he made the most of it, and she didn't even notice. What was his name? Edwin Waller, Uncle Paul said. They had poetry readings in the old drawing room. They invited everyone they thought might be able to do him some good. I found it nauseating. Martin looked questioningly at his uncle. You know, you think of me as I am now. You've no idea that I could have ever been rebellious. But age is a way of creeping up on you. You shouldn't forget that. Martin remained silent. A wind must have sprung up outside. The tops of the waves were flecked with foam. They would fill the drawing room with folding chairs, and there was a kind of small raised platform in front of the fireplace. And they'd put the poet on that. And then Sylvia and Henrietta would light candles. Doesn't sound so bad. Not until you heard his poems. He was American. He was old. But he was one of those romantic poets. New apocalyptics, they called them. Along with Dylan Thomas and Henry Treece. It was the kind of poetry that, if you could easily make sense of it, that meant it wasn't any good. Did he wear a brown suit? What kind of a question's that? I just wondered. If I'm trying to tell you something, Martin, the least you can do is listen. You have to remember, it wasn't long after the war. Food was still rationed. Even coal and candles were hard to get. They had him here for the whole of that winter. He was supposed to be writing a poem about a dry shipwreck. Isn't that a contradiction in terms? It's exactly the kind of thing I'm trying to tell you about. It was supposed to be psychological, or elms and shingles and cormorants and brothers dying by the waves. Why brothers? Don't ask me, Martin. I'm not a poet. I made my living in a merchant bank. It was not long after Freud came to this country to die. You were supposed to let your unconscious surface. It was supposed to be good for you. It was a long shot, but Martin had to try. Are you saying Henrietta was murdered because she was involved with the new apocalyptics? There was another silence. Martin looked out of the conservatory window. The increasingly choppy tide crept towards them across the sands. Not for the first time, Martin felt something distinctly disturbing in the atmosphere of the rectory, despite all the outward appearances to the contrary. Police didn't think so. They arrested a local man. He's deaf. They even got a confession out of him, despite his brother's protest. I was never convinced of his guilt. I thought you said you were in London. I came down. Your father followed later. Sylvia was distraught. Someone had to do something. And I organized things. Obituary notices. The funeral. Your father depended on me. It was only later that I failed him. What do you mean? Paul's voice showed visible strain again. Martin, I have to tell you. That's why I wanted to see you. Your father was never the same after he inherited Plas Wern Las. It took its toll on him. That's why, in the end, after his death, I decided to get rid of everything except the house. I'm sorry. I'm sorry if I made a mistake. Rest, Martin said. Paul was unwell. Even if he had made mistakes all those years ago, it was too late to do anything about it now, except suffer the consequences.